In contrast to scramble competition, interactions exhibiting interference competition include those involving direct killing, aggressive displacement behavior and the production of chemicals, deterrents and pheromones that hinder colonization, feeding or oviposition. Dino et al. 1995, Kaplan and Dino 2007. For example, in a guild of stem borers comprised of lepidopterans, beetless sandflies, there is a dominance hierarchy based in either size or aggression, whereby the dominant species Chilodemotellus kills, but does not consume, the subordinate species when they meet within the same grass stem. Stilling and Strong 1984. Also, larger females of the gall aphid, Pemphigus vitae, push smaller ones away from optimal oviposition sites on leaves of narrowleaf cottonwood Populus angustifolia. Witham 1979, figure 4.11a. Similarly, male dragonflies engage in aggressive tangles with other males when defending territories along pond edges. Tsubaki et al. 1994. By so doing, winning males deny losers access to resources such as prey and mates. Also, many herbivores, predators and parasitoids produce chemical cues marking a. Time. DENC. Time. DENCTY. Time. Pheromones that indirectly deter potential competitors, either conspecifics or in some cases heterospecifics, from ovipositing or feeding in the same host plant tissue or nearby area. Dino et al. 1995, Merlin et al. 1996, Hempton et al. 2001, Nufio and Papage 2001. Such pseudointerference mechanisms have the same effect as direct interference phenomena in that they deny or dissuade a competitor access to shared resources without aggressive interactions. In general, interference competition is thought to lead to more stable population dynamics than exploitative competition because as resources become depleted, some individuals in the population will retain access to sufficient resources for growth, reproduction and survival. Figure 5.1b. Despite our dichotomous treatment of scramble and interference competition so far, populations of many insects likely exhibit a mix of both types of competition. For example, ovipositing females of the beanweevil, Callosobruchus maculatus, deposit a marking pheromone on beans which inhibits egg deposition by its congener Callosobruchus rhodiogenus, but the reverse does not occur. Asymmetric interference competition. However, in mixed species populations where larvae scramble for access to beans, C. maculatus often excludus rhodiogenus. Asymmetric exploitative competition. Gigon Smith 1985. Consumers also compete for enemy-free space. Jeffries and Lawton 1984, a phenomenon also termed apparent competition. Holt 1977, 1984, Chainton and Bonsall 2000, Van Veen et al. 2006, Kaplan and Dino 2007. Consider a single predator species that attacks two prey species. Both prey species are adversely affected by the predator and the predator benefits by consuming both prey species. Furthermore, an increase in the predator's abundance is a consequence of consuming prey species 1 enhances its negative effect on prey species 2. Thus, prey species 1 indirectly affects prey species 2 and vice versa, in the same way that two prey species might compete exploitatively for a shared food resource. Figure 5.2. A good example of apparent competition between two leafhopper species involves the shared parasitoid Anagrussopose, which resulted in the partial replacement of a native leafhopper, Erythronera elegantula, by an invading species E. variabilis, following its introduction into the vineyards of California. Settle and Wilson 1990. The competitive displacement resulted from the selective attack of the native species eggs, which were reinserted closer to the leaf surface and consequently experienced greater parasitism. Thus, the native leafhopper was dramatically reduced by the invader because the invader competed more successfully for enemy-free space, namely deep oviposition sites. It should be evident by now that the strength of lateral interactions such as competition and facilitation can be mediated by other factors, both biotic and abiotic. As exemplified by herbivorous insects, competition, both intraspecific and interspecific, can be plant-mediated, natural enemy-mediated or physical factor-mediated. Damon 1993, Dino et al. 1995, Dino and Kaplan 2007, Kaplan and Dino 2007, all of which constitute indirect effects. Indirect effects occur when the influence of one species, the donor, is transmitted through a second species, the transmitter, to a third species. Morin 1999. Concerning plant-mediated competition, we learned in Chapter 4 that previous feeding B1 herbivore often induces changes in the defensive chemistry, nutrition or morphology, e.g., trichomes, of its host plant that have negative consequences for other herbivore species feeding elsewhere in the same plant or later in the season. Inber et al. 1995, Carbon and Baldwin 1997, Constable 1999, Kaplan and Dino 2007. In such cases OFI-induced resistance, herbivores compete entirely through feeding-induced changes in the quality or availability of their shared plant resource. Moreover, natural enemies can both mediate the intensity of interspecific competition between insect herbivores and alter the outcome of competition between two species, as evidenced by the parasitoid mediation of leafhopper competition on grapes. Even subtle changes in physical conditions can also shift the competitive outcome of species interactions. For instance, at 30C the bean weevil, Callosobruchus chinensis, excludes C. maculatus in mixed species cultures, but a 2C increase completely reverses the outcome and its rival becomes the superior competitor. Fuji 1967. The take-home message from these scenarios is that competition, and other lateral interactions for that matter, cannot be viewed in isolation of other factors that mediate the frequency and strength of competitive interactions. Suffice it to say for now, recent analysis of published studies on the nature of plant-mediated competitive interactions among insect herbivores are challenging the traditional paradigms of competition theory, Dino and Kaplan 2007, Kaplan and Dino 2007. We will learn more about this evolving issue shortly, and explore in greater depth plant, enemy and physical factor-mediated competition and facilitation. 5.1.2 Competition, Predation, Facilitation and Niche Theory. How an organism uses resources in time and space, its so-called niche, has been intimately linked to competitive interactions throughout much of the historic development of population and community ecology, Daman 1993, Dino et al. 1995, Kaplan and Dino 2007. Several stages of niche theory development are often recognized. These include the original formulation of a species niche as a spatial unit, Grinnell 1904, 1917, the recognition of the niche as a functional unit, Elton 1927, the development of the competitive exclusion principle, Gause 1934, the emergence of the multidimensional niche, Hutchinson 1957, and more recently, consideration of multiple factors. Exploitation competition. Prey species 1, prey species 2. Apparent competition. Resource. Consumer 1, consumer 2. Dash. Plus. Competition, predation and facilitation in the shaping of an organism's niche, Jeffries and Lawton 1984, Bruno et al. 2003. Although Darwin was certainly aware of the idea of a species niche, the concept is credited to Grinnell, who envisioned a species niche as its distribution in space. Elton broadened the concept and viewed an organism's niche as its functional role in the community, more specifically its place in the biotis environment and relations to food and enemies. Thus, the niche became an interaction-based concept, and this view persists today. Gause 1934 was the first ecologist credited with identifying the linkage between niche theory and interspecific competition. He remarked that, as a result of competition, two similar species scarcely ever occupy similar niches, but displace each other in such a manner that each takes possession of certain kinds of food and modes of life in which it has an advantage over its competitor. Emerging from his work was the competitive exclusion principle, which posits that two species with identical niche requirements cannot coexist. Gause based this principle on Elton's functional definition of the niche. Hutchinson, 1957, later redefined the niche as an n-dimensional hypervolume, an abstract multidimensional space identifying the environmental limits within which a species is able to survive and reproduce. Each niche dimension corresponded to a specific requisite such as the range of temperatures required for development, the seed sizes that can be consumed, the thickness of plant tissue within which eggs can be deposited, etc. Hutchinson further defined a species' fundamental niche as its pattern of resource use in the absence of competitors and its realized niche when competing species or other organisms were present, figure 5.3a. Thus, as a consequence of interspecific competition, a species' realized niche is predicted to be smaller than its fundamental niche due to competitive displacement along part of one or more niche dimensions. The scale insect Furinia externa, for example, displaces the rival scale Nuculispis sugae from the nitrogen-rich terminal needles of hemlock trees and relegates it to feeding on mature needles, where it incurs reduced fecundity and heavy mortality, McClure 1980. When F. externa is experimentally removed, N. sugae freely expands its distribution along the hemlock shoot by colonizing the terminal needles, where it thrives. Such subtraction experiments, in which one competitor is removed, demonstrate niche release and document that the realized niche of a species when a competitor is present is smaller than its fundamental niche when that competitor is absent. Although not emphasized by Hutchinson, 1957, predators, parasitoids and pathogens can also influence a species' use of resources and thus its niche, Chainton and Bonsall 2000, Dino et al. 1995, Kaplan and Dino 2007, figure 5.3a. We just saw that realized niche, oviposition space in grape leaves, of a native leafhopper species was dramatically restricted by an introduced leafhopper as a consequence of the invasive species' competitive superiority for enemy-free space from a shared parasitoid, Settle and Wilson 1990. Similarly, colonias off the nettle aphid, Microlithium carnosum, suffer more rapid declines in density over the growing season on plants adjacent to grassland patches with high densities of the grass aphid, Rhopalocyphumpity, than on nettle plants growing close to patches where grass aphids are scarce. Similarly, colonias off the nettle aphid, Microlithium carnosum, suffer more rapid declines in density over the growing season on plants adjacent to grassland patches with high densities of the grass aphid, Rhopalocyphumpity, than on nettle plants growing close to patches where grass aphids are scarce. Differences in performance and distribution of nettle aphid colonies resulted from a predaceous ladybird that aggregated on high-density R. patipatchesanda, spill-over, effect onto neighboring nettle patches, Mu Diaresis Lur and Godfrey 1997. The realized niche of nettle aphids was restricted in the presence of grass aphids due to a shared predator. These and other studies on predator-prey systems suggest that apparent competition can arise when alternative prey-species display overlapping temporal dynamics and a predator shifts its attack to include a co-occurring prey-species in its diet, Chainton and Bonsall 2000, Kaplan and Eubanks 2005. Positive interactions among insect species such as facilitation and mutualism can in fact broaden the realized niche of a species beyond that predicted by its fundamental niche, Bruno et al. 2003, figure 5.3b. In cases of facilitation, resources are made available to one species only by the actions of another species. For example, high levels of defoliation by one herbivore can elicit a positive density response in subsequent herbivores by weakening plant defense systems, e.g., resin flow in conifers, or stimulating a reflush of young leaves. Kaplan and Dino 2007. All factors considered, a practical definition of an organism's realized niche is its pattern of resource use resulting from interactions with the physical environment, abiotic factors, and other organisms, including conspecifics, other competing species, mutualists and natural enemies. Biotic factors. In later sections of this chapter we provide evidence for the relative frequency and strength of negative competition and amensalism, and positive interactions, facilitation and mutualism, as influence the distribution and abundance of insect herbivores and consumers at higher trophic levels. 5.1.3 Modeling interspecific competition. Mathematical models have been developed describing the adverse effects of two species on each other's population growth. The first of these endeavors, the Lotka-Volterra model of interspecific competition, named for its originators, Lotka 1925, Volterra 1926a, b, extends from the logistic growth equation for a single species, Verhulst 1838. dn. dt 1/4 Rn an k 5 1, where n is population size, r is the per capita exponential growth of a population and k is the carrying capacity of the environment or the average number of individuals of a species the environment can support. Thus, the equation describes the rate of population change based on the size of the population, its growth rate and how far the current population size is from the carrying capacity of the environment. The term con k modifies population growth r, depending on population size n, relative to the carrying capacity k, such that r is positive below k and negative above it. The model possesses a simple equilibrium solution. When a population is small relative to the carrying capacity n less than k, the population grows exponentially. However, when the population reaches the carrying capacity n 1/4 k, it levels off and remains there due to resource limitation. Figure 5.4a. Equilibrium is reached at the carrying capacity where the population ceases to grow, dn dt 1/4 o, and importantly when con k 1/4 0, which occurs when n 1/4 k. Simply stated, the logistic growth equation describes intraspecific competition whereby competition among individuals of the same species for limited resources sets the limit on population growth. The logistic growth model, equation 5.1, can be extended to consider the effects of interspecific competition on population growth, specifically the consequences of one species' density on the growth of a second species and vice versa. Two equations, the Lotka-Volterra model, are needed to model the reciprocal density effects of two species on each other's population growth. As developed by Lotka 1925 and Volterra 1926a, the two equations, one for each competing species, are dn1 dt 1/4 r1 n1 k1 an1 an2 k1 5 2 dn2 dt 1/4 r2 n2 k2 an2 abn1 k2 5 3, where each species has its own characteristic r, n and k, as indicated by the subscripts 1 and 2. Also, the terms n2 and bn1 have been added to the growth equation. 5.1 The competition coefficients a and b convert individuals of one competing species into equivalent units of the other competitor. Thus, equation 5.2 denotes the effect of an individual of species 2 on species 1, and b, equation 5.3, indicates the effect of an individual of species 1 on species 2. If, for example, a 1/4 0.8, each individual of species 2 uses 0.8 of the resources used by an individual of species 1. More specifically, if the population size of species 2 increases by 100 individuals, the population size of species 1 will decline by 80 individuals. In this example, individuals of species 1 suffer more from competition with conspecifics, intraspecific competition, than from interspecific competition with individuals of species 2. dn n2 dt rn equals k1 n1 alpha dn time t population dency n closing parenthesis a b dt rn kn k equals. Figure 5.4a exponential growth, left curve, describes population growth in the absence of resource limitation. In logistic growth, right curve, resource limitation causes the population to level off at the carrying capacity. B, the zero growth isocline, describes the range of equilibrium densities where dn dt 1/4 0 for one competing species in the presence of another. Each point along the line represents an equilibrium density for species 1 at differing densities of species 2. The equilibrium density of species 1 declines with increasing densities of species 2, adapted from Spade et al. 1999. By contrast, if b 1/4 1.3, an increase in species 1 by 100 individuals would cause the population size of species 2 to drop by 130. In this instance for species 2, interspecific competition with individuals of species 1 is more intense than intraspecific competition. The competitive superiority of species 2 over species 1, b greater than it, might arise because it is either larger or more aggressive. Equilibrium densities for the two competing species n1 and n2 can be determined by setting dn dt to 0 in equations 5.2 and 5.3. Recall that for a single species population, dn dt 1/4 0 when the population is at carrying capacity n 1/4 k. In the two species model, the equations reduce to n1 and a quarter k1a and 2 5 4 n. n2 and a quarter k2 ab n1 5 5. As a result, the equilibrium density for species 1 N1 is no longer expressed as a single density, but varies depending on the density of species 2 N2 and its competition coefficient A. Likewise, this is the case for species 2. These two equations 5.4 and 5.5 describe straight lines with the competition coefficients characterizing the slopes. So-called zero-growth isoclines describe the range of equilibrium densities where dn dt1 quarter 0 for each competing species. The line for species 1, figure 5.4b, crosses the x-axis where n2 and a quarter 0. Setting n2 to 0 in equation 5.4 allows us to obtain the value n1 and a quarter k1. Likewise, the line must cross the y-axis when n1 and a quarter 0, and by substituting n1 and a quarter 0 into equation 5.4 we can also determine when n2 and a quarter k1 a. In this example, the equilibrium density of species 1 declines with increasing densities of species 2. The zero-growth isocline for species 2 can be calculated in the same way using equation 5.5 such that the isocline must cross the y-axis at k2 and the x-axis at k2b. Knowing the equilibrium conditions dn dt1 quarter 0 for each competitor, figure 5.4b, now allows us to predict whether or not their combined equilibrium densities permit coexistence. This can be established by plotting the isoclines for both species on the same graph, figure 5.5. First, let's consider the case where species 1 always excludes species 2, figure 5.5a. This occurs because the isocline for species 2 falls entirely within the isocline for species 1. As a consequence, at any density combination between the two isoclines, the population trajectory leading to K1 results in a population increase for species 1 and a decrease for species 2. The reverse case in which species 2 prevails is shown in figure 5.5b. Here the isocline for species 1 is nested entirely within that for species 2, and the population trajectory of species 2 toward K2 will promote the demise of species 1. The case of an unstable equilibrium is shown in figure 5.5c. In this example, the winning competitor depends on the starting densities of the two species and on their relative growth rates. If initial conditions favor a population trajectory where the isocline for species 2 exceeds that for species 1, upper left triangle, then species 2 will drive species 1 to extinction. The reverse occurs if initial conditions lead the population trajectory into the zone, lower right triangle, where species 1 outcompetes species 2. An unstable equilibrium point exists where the two isoclines intersect, but any environmental factor that causes a change in the density of either species will destabilize the interaction and promote the extinction of one of the competing species. A stable equilibrium exists between both species coexistence only if the isoclines of both cross such that the carrying capacities of each species fall within the isocline of the other species, figure 5.5d. For coexistence to occur, K1 must be less than K2b on the x-axis and K2 must be less than K1 a on the y-axis. In this case, intraspecific competition exceeds interspecific competition, and each competitor will limit its own population growth before it drives its competitor to extinction. Stated in other terms, and as predicted by the Lotka-Volterra model, stable coexistence is possible only when the product of the competition coefficients, AB, is less than 1, that is when intraspecific competition is greater than any interspecific effect for either species. 5.1.4 Coexistence and the niche, a theoretical perspective. Given that the Lotka-Volterra model predicts stable coexistence when intraspecific competitive effects are stronger than interspecific ones, AB less than 1, any factor reducing interspecific competition should favor coexistence. Intuitively, any differential use of resources by two competing species, niche divergence or resource partitioning, should reduce interspecific competition and concentrate intraspecific effects. Also, implicit in the competitive exclusion principle is that niche divergence between species promotes coexistence. What remains unanswered so far in our discussion is how much niche divergence is necessary to ensure coexistence, how much niche differentiation actually occurs in nature, and whether or not niche divergence along N2 alpha specific resource dimensions indeed reduces interspecific competition. With regard to the last question, might two phloem feeding aphid species compete severely for a common phloem resource even though they exhibit niche divergence by feeding at different locations on the plant? We will explore such issues in due course. Nonetheless, the first two questions are long-standing and involved ones that were first addressed by MacArthur and Levins, 1967, and later developed by May, 1973c. Our rendering of their argument is as follows. Consider three species competing for a single resource that varies continuously along a one-dimensional gradient. Picture for example seeds that vary in size from small to large and an assemblage of three weevil species that bore into the seeds. Each weevil species occupies its own realized niche along the seed resource dimension. Consider a normal distribution of seed sizes used by each species, namely its resource utilization curve, where each weevil efficiently consumes seeds at the center of its niche, and fails to exploit seeds beyond the tail ends of the distribution, figure 5.6. The more the resource utilization curves overlap, the more intense is interspecific competition. Accordingly, the competition coefficient A for each species can be expressed as a 1/4 E add 2 equals 4W2, 5, 6, where W is the standard deviation of each curve, and index of relative niche width, and D is the distance between peaks. Consequently, A is small when the three species diverge in their use of seeds toward non-overlap D, W greater than 1, figure 5.6a, and approaches 1 as the utilization curves converge toward complete niche overlap D, W less than 1, figure 5.6b. Overall, theory predicts that selection resulting from interspecific competition, also apparent competition, acts to narrow a species' niche, whereas intraspecific competition broadens its niche, figure 5.6c. Moreover, selection resulting from these two opposing competitive pressures should result in an assemblage of species that fully exploits the range of resources, leaving no so-called vacant niches available. Accordingly, the consequences of these evolutionary, pushing and shoving matches, bear heavily on the number of species able to coexist or pack into the community in what is termed species. D. W. Packing. In this context, the question still remains, however, as to how much niche overlap is permitted before one species excludes another. May 1973C explored the issue by assuming that the two peripheral species in a three-species assemblage have the same carrying capacity K1 or the suitability of resources available for species 1 and 3, and examined the opportunity for coexistence of another species, species 2, nestled between them with a carrying capacity of K2, see figure 5.6b. Stable coexistence of the assemblages indicated for different values of K1, K2 in relation to DW, niche overlap, figure 5.7. When DW is low, A is high and interspecific competition is intense, the conditions for coexistence K1, K2 are very constrained. As DW increases and approaches unity, a declines in interspecific competition is relaxed, stable coexistence becomes possible, but only when available resources are similarly suitable for all species K1, K2 to 1. Any environmental change that promotes variation in the K1, K2 ratio will allow for coexistence only within the stable region of the model, figure 5.7. Thus, for low values of DW, high niche overlap, coexistence is very unlikely when K1, K2 deviates much from unity. For our weevil example, this might occur when some environmental factor results in relatively lower seed quality for species 2, K2, thus increasing K1, K2. High values of DW, reduced interspecific competition, promote stable coexistence, but they are likely selected against in the real world due to intense interspecific competition. Thus, environmental uncertainty when DW is low and intraspecific competition when DW is high suggests that stable coexistence is most likely when DW is approximately equal to 1. Although this model provides a logical estimate of how much niche overlap is allowed for species to coexist, it has several inherent drawbacks. First, the model examines species interactions along a single resource dimension. In fact, most species divide their use of resources among more than one niche dimension. As a consequence, high niche overlap along one dimension may provide little indication of the strength of interspecific competition. For instance, our weevils may overlap considerably in the size of seeds they exploit, but if each species specializes on seeds from a different plant species, overlap in seed size use per se is of little consequence for predicting coexistence. Thus, estimates of DW along multiple resource dimensions must be taken into account to better estimate stable coexistence, see Abrams 1976. Moreover, identifying competition as the sole factor underlying patterns of resource use in the field is an experimental and statistical challenge. Nonetheless, the model identifies a specific limit to how similar species can be and still coexist and suggests that this limit represents a balance between intraspecific competition and resource-based equilibria that are too precarious to prevail in the real world. Began et al. 2006. In other words, we see that coexistence depends on factors other than niche overlap DW, such as resource suitability and environmental variance. Again, we see that competitive interactions cannot be studied in isolation of other mediating factors. 2. 1.